Hello, welcome to the latest MoLab conversation from the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology in Halle in Germany. So this has been almost exactly 2 weeks since Russia invaded Ukraine. Like many of you, our colleagues and myself feel spillage and helpless. We don't know what to say and what to think. Sometimes I think, Putin actually is not so much older than me, and he is much younger than my father, and how could he do that? And I just checked who led the Russian delegation to negotiate with Ukraine in February in Belarus. And the head of the delegation is just 2 years older than me, and he was a minister of culture, a political scientist, and a historian. So this is already quite telling. So the person led the delegation is an academic, right? So this is not a purely military operation. So we know the world will change profoundly, but we don't know how. At this moment, I think it is important for us to speak out, to express our feelings, our views, even though we know our views are biased, are based on partial observations, which may well be revised afterwards, after we know more. But it is still important to talk to each other about this, and this is a way how we engage with history. So today's conversation is literally a conversation, meaning that we share our views, perceptions, and in a way to understand better, not necessarily understand better about history, but understand better how we should live with history at the moment. So I'm very pleased and very grateful that Deborah Jones today agreed to join me to have this conversation. Deborah is our postdoc fellow in the department since quite a few years back,
Yeah.
And Deborah has worked on Ukraine, has spent many years in Ukraine as well as in Russia to do field research. So Deborah, welcome to MoLab Conversation.
Thank you.
To start with, I know that you are not only following news and thinking what is going on, but actually you are also taking actions at this moment, particularly by helping people whom you know in Ukraine to leave and to move to the western part of the continent. Can you tell us what you have been doing?
Well, thank you so much for the introduction. I'm happy to be here. I feel like I really can't do enough at the moment here from Germany. However, I was in the fortunate situation to be able to offer housing to an old friend of mine, her mother, her sister, and her sister's 2 children, ages 1.5 and 7. I also have a child that's about 1.5 years old, so this is particularly striking to think about what it would be like to have to leave home at this moment. So we were able to find them housing in Berlin, and many people have facilitated their trip from Ukraine to Germany. They're not certain how long they're going to stay. They're from Western Ukraine, which for now is not as badly affected by the violence. However, people are facing things like there not being food in the grocery stores, there not being medicine in the pharmacies, generally just a lot of instability in the sense of not knowing what might come next. So it's, well, most of the military action by Russia has been further in the east and in the south. They did go through and take out all of these military bases also in quite far western Ukraine, which is something that yeah, so it's where the action is something that's changing constantly. So we were able to help them with housing. I feel like I'm at this point now where I hear Ukrainian and Russian in a way I just never have before in Germany. And I was just yesterday on the Marketplatz here in Halle, and I saw a family of people who were looking a little bit confused, and they were speaking Russian, because Ukrainians often speak both. Many people speak Russian, Ukrainian, they switch back and forth. And I don't know whether or not they were refugees, but it was a group of women. And one of the things I've heard is that Ukrainian refugees are fairly easy to identify because they tend to be in groups of women and children, because men at this point are not allowed to, men between 18 and 60 are not allowed to leave Ukraine. So most of the people who are coming are seniors, people with disabilities, women, children, and then of course Ukraine also had many international students who were there, usually for either medicine or music, who also have
I heard that many people, I mean, apart from, the able man between the age of 18 and 60, but they also choose not to leave Ukraine. Is that the case? Even among the person you know?
So I think one of the things that many of us who have done research in Ukraine or who have ties in Ukraine but live outside of Ukraine have been saying is, well, I tried to talk to my loved ones or my interlocutors about leaving. I offered money, I offered housing, and they don't want to leave.
Yeah, why?
So there are a few different reasons for that. So certainly you have populations that can't leave, whether because they are not legally allowed to right now or because the journey is going to be too difficult for them. So for people with disabilities or many senior citizens feel that the journey is going to be too hard for them. I think one thing that's a little tough for people who are here in the West or in the EU to understand when they see all this outpouring of aid, they say, oh, but we're here and we're ready to host you and we have donations for you. And everything's going to be okay. And what they don't understand is how hard it is to get to the border.
Before that, yes.
Yeah, and that certain places, like people cannot are sort of stranded, or literally stranded. They cannot get out, or they're afraid to try to cross because there have been cases like just a couple days ago that there was a family leaving Irpin near Kiev, which is one of the particularly badly hit places, and the family was at a checkpoint, and there was a Russian military strike, and the family, including their children, were all killed. So those are the sorts of things that people are very fearful of. And then there are also logistical matters like fuel shortages. So maybe you would have been able to get a ride, maybe you even own a car, but you don't have fuel, or the trains are full. So it can be very harrowing to try to leave. And then again, imagine doing that with small kids or an elderly parent.
Is it also a reason some people choose not to leave because they fear if they leave, they may never go back to their home?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I also see this with the family that I'm hosting. So we went over what sorts of things you need to do once you arrive in the EU. And so one important thing to understand, and one thing that makes the current situation quite different from 2014 at the start of the war in Donbass, is that Ukrainians have visa-free travel privileges to the EU now. So they can come and they can technically stay for 90 days, just like me as an American, without registering or having a visa. So they have some flexibility. But if you require services, if you are from Kharkiv or Kherson or Mariupol and you somehow manage to get out of Mariupol and you head west, you are probably not going to be going back. And so you know that. And so you would probably go and register as a refugee quite quickly. For people, but that's a painful thing to do, to go and register yourself. This is a performative act of registering. You're saying, I am a refugee, is something that's very frightening for people. And I also saw this in 2014 when people were leaving the Donbass region. I was in Odessa at the train stations talking to people who were arriving from that conflict. And there were so many people who would tell me things like, I'm just here to rest for a while. We'll just stay with my friend. We'll pretend it's a holiday. And because it's really hard to think about not going
It is hard because by declaring yourself being a refugee, it means a very abrupt rupture from your past, right?
Absolutely.
You have to reinvent yourself.
You have to reinvent yourself and also remember that these are families that have been broken apart right now. So to say you're a refugee and to say you are going to stay in Poland or Slovakia, Hungary, Germany, Romania, Moldova, it's also, you're saying you're going to stay for a while, and also that you're going to be separated from your family.
Yes.
So the children that we are hosting are separated from their father, and they don't know when they're going to see him again.
Yes, that's fascinating and very touching. You know, most of us just watched how people arrived and received all the very generous support on the TV screen. But we often forget the long journey behind the screen before arrival.
Yeah.
And we only look at the people, how they arrive, and we forget how difficult it is to leave in the first place, both emotionally and logistically.
Yes, absolutely.
And lots of media, not at this time, but certainly before, we're talking about how people claim refugee status on bogus grounds by fabrication, etc. But we often forget, actually, it takes lots of courage and the pain to declare yourself for being a refugee.
Yes, absolutely. And not only in Ukraine, so looking at people who cross through the Sonoran Desert to go into the United States, or people who cross the Mediterranean and don't receive nearly the same welcome that Ukrainians
Of course,
have.
yeah. That's another topic we should talk
That is
to.
absolutely another topic we have to address.
Yeah. Deborah, so can we go back a bit, and how did you become interested in Ukraine in the first place?
Yeah, so I studied Russian as an undergrad.
Okay.
And when I was studying in Russia in 2004, that was, Ukraine had the Orange Revolution in 2004, which was another one of these pro-Western, sort of what's referred to as the color revolutions that you saw in a number of countries in the former Soviet bloc. And that's a longer story. But what I remember at that time when I was living in Russia was that the conflict was constantly in Ukraine was depicted as a conflict between East and West.
Okay.
And drawn along ethno-linguistic lines. And it was also depicted that way in Western media as well. So it was actually fairly consistent between Russian and Western media at that point, which is something, I mean, not entirely consistent, but that's certainly, you know, they took different sides, but the way they framed the conflict was probably just much more similar than anything you would see now.
Mainly as ethnic issues.
And ethno-linguistic specifically, in which Ukrainian was a proxy for Ukrainian ethnicity and identity, and being Russophone was claimed as a proxy for a more Russian ethnicity, and which is so anyway, I became interested in Ukraine, and I thought this would be a really interesting topic to
About the
ethno-linguistic, how not sort of. So what I later understood, because I was not a linguistic anthropologist or any sort of anthropologist at that point, that I was interested in language ideology.
And then you find out is a case actually is a divide is very deep, or actually is not.
No. And so this is one of the things that I when we were discussing before, I said it's one of these things that when you work in Ukraine, you forget that you have to explain this to people all the time, that yes, language is important, but it's not nearly as important as anyone outside of Ukraine seems to think it is. So yes, I ended up doing my first bit of research in Ukraine actually as a master's student in 2008 and 2009, and I became interested in so anyway, you get to Ukraine and you quickly realize that people had this habit of engaging in what the linguistic anthropologist Lada Bilinuk, she's American of Ukrainian descent, terms non-accommodating bilingualism, which means you speak Ukrainian and I speak Russian, and it's fine because we understand each other, and we don't necessarily force each other to switch. And one of the things I've argued in my own work is when people speak two different languages that they each understand, that it's not necessarily combative. It can be, you know, someone refusing to switch to another language, perhaps in an official setting. It can be combative. But I've also seen that as a sign of intimacy among old friends, that they just know the other person is a Russian speaker, a Ukrainian speaker, and that's the language they speak, and it's fine. And that's how conversation in Ukraine operated during much of my research period there. It's certainly a way that many people in Ukrainians do talk to each other. Since 2014, I think you do see a number of younger people in Ukraine, especially switching to Ukrainian.
Okay.
It's considered particularly powerful if you are ethnic Russian, grew up Russophone, but consider yourself a Ukrainian patriot to switch to Ukrainian as your primary language. It can be a very strong political stance, absolutely, but it isn't necessarily an everyday life.
I see. So what have changed after 2014 in the Ukrainian society?
So, wow, lots of things, but also lots of things that remain the same. So I think one of the things that I've seen in my own research areas. So first of all, I should explain that most of my research has been in more Russophone areas. Some of that is because I've gone through phases of being more of a Russian speaker and more of a Ukrainian speaker. I learned Russian first. It's always a bit easier for me. Now that I'm a German speaker, I find I can switch easily between German and Russian, but I have trouble switching when I start throwing Ukrainian into the mix. But I understand it fine, and it's something I realize now that I also need to push my Ukrainian a little further. But so anyway, I worked particularly in Odessa region for quite some time, which is near the Black Sea. So Odessa region, so you have sort of states in Ukraine, and they're all named, or usually are named after the administrative capital of that region. So Odessa region, the capital of that is Odessa, but the region as a whole hugs Moldova north and south and runs along the Black Sea coast. And it's historically a very ethnically diverse region. So Odessa in particular is known for its Jewish population. You go an hour outside of the city, going north, it becomes very Ukrainian, but there are also historically a lot of Bulgarian populations, Moldova, Gagauz, Roma populations, Greek populations, so Romanian, of course. So it's quite mixed. But that's a really good case study for how Russian becomes an international language and was not necessarily, of course you have ethnic Russians there. But so Russian for them was often an international language, so the way we are speaking English now, and not necessarily something that tells you anything about ethnic identity. And even more than that, Odessiti are very concerned about being Odessan. So very, very strong regional identities as well that have historically been important. One thing I do see now in Ukraine is regional identities are still important for many people, but not necessarily, or not nearly as important as I think they were even 10 years ago. And I think that has a lot to do with having this war and having the annexation of Crimea, for example. So what has really, really united Ukrainians, in my observation, has been having this experience of this war with Russia. And people are really devastated by it. They didn't think it would happen.
That's very interesting. You mentioned that actually Russian was widely spoken as a common language for communication, and somehow is for more efficient, conversation, rather than as a sign of a cultural attachment, let alone political alliance. So that's probably was mistaken by outsider observers. So your overall prediction is that after the war, actually the Ukrainian national identity, a civic identity, will become stronger and become more cohesive.
And I think it's absolutely already there. So, and there are a number of reasons why that is the case. So my most recent, so I've worked in Odessa, I've worked in Vinnytsia, which is the province north of, province or region, oblast is the word, north of Odessa, which is a more ethnic Ukrainian ethnically Ukrainian region, but it's also at this crossroads. And I think also an important thing to keep in mind is just in many countries of the world, people moved around in the 20th and 21st century. So what was historically ethnically Ukrainian is not, or ethnically Russian is not necessarily the case anymore. So there I've done some field work in Kyiv and also in working with teams of lawyers who were helping people register their privatized plots of land. This is a lot of research, but the point is that I've been in a number of different parts of the country. But my most recent field work was out at the border between what was, until a couple of weeks ago, Kyiv-controlled Luhansk region. So very close to the separatist territories and right at the Russian border. Okay. So I was working in a village there that was had a number of problems with landmines and tripwires from the war that began in 2014. And you know, I was fat. No, of course, as in any case with ethnographic research, you choose your interlocutors, but your interlocutors also choose you. So the people who were speaking to me were people who were not afraid to talk to an American. So that's obviously a consideration. But they were a little more accustomed to aid workers being and journalists being around. So I was not the first international person they'd necessarily encountered. But we had a lot of conversations about identity and borders and to the extent at which they had mattered. And this was a village that had been attacked, actually had a conflict between Ukrainian and Russian border guards. So not just separatist activity. And the people there, I mean, they would tell me things like, I have family in Russia, friends in Russia. When I went abroad to work, I worked in Russia. I was educated in Russia. My family's Russophone. And they felt all these strong ties to Russia. But when the war started and they tried to tell their Russian friends and family about what had happened to them, a lot of those Russian friends and family said things like, oh, well, that was a false flag operation by Ukraine. This didn't actually happen to you. And they were just so shocked. And I remember one of my interlocutors saying, we always went together like left and right, Russia and Ukraine, this village and the other village on the other side. And that just really broke down. And that doesn't mean that they were Ukrainian nationalists by any means. But it did mean that they didn't necessarily just have an questioning feelings of alliance with Russia. And these were people who did not support the Maidan Revolution. Oh, okay. But came to be very, I wouldn't say they're necessarily like pro-Ukrainian.
But they will read their own situation.
But pro-sovereignty for Ukraine. Okay. I see that right now in Odessa as well, where the mayor of Odessa was this really quite associated with the pro-Russian political parties. My more like activist pro-Ukrainian friends did not like him, but I saw an interview with him on the news, and Odessa's known as this sort of resort community, places where people, like Russians, would go to vacation. And he said, we welcome Russian guests, but we do not welcome Russian invaders. And so they're all out there with their sandbags and homemade barricades and weapons. Preparing for invasion.
So I mean, he also changed his position.
So they're not necessarily, so these are people who are pro-Ukrainian sovereignty. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're anti-Russian or that they never want to speak Russian language again. But I think what you really see here is this consolidation around Ukrainian sovereignty and sort of a civic identity that emphasizes that these people should be able to govern themselves and make decisions about their country's future on their own without interference from Moscow.
Thank you so much, Deborah, for bringing us all these insights based on your fieldwork observation, which is extremely valuable nowadays for us here. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.